Today we're going to do the next Mishnah in our series, and we're also going to do the next Mishnah in the book of Pirkei Avos. How does that sound? Sounds good? Yes? Okay, let us begin. We're up to mitzvah number 77, and this is another mitzvah that deals with the court proceedings and the court deliberations, and we're specifically talking about how a court processes a capital crime case. And the Mishnah in the book of Sanhedrin, which deals with a lot of the jurisprudence and judicial proceedings and protocol and how exactly we process court cases, the Mishnah tells us that there are different categories of court cases. There's, of course, capital crime cases, and then there are civil cases or monetary cases, and the laws of how we process these different cases are different. So the Mishnah tells us that both monetary and capital crime cases, we have to investigate and interrogate the witnesses, we have to cross-examine the witnesses, we have to evaluate if these witnesses are legit or maybe they are fraudulent. However, there are 10 differences between monetary cases, between civil cases, and between capital crime cases. Number one, a monetary court, you need only 3 justices, whereas a capital crime case, you need a minor Sanhedrin, namely a court comprised of 23 justices. Number one. Number two, capital cases, you must begin the deliberations with arguments for acquittal. You cannot say, when you start the deliberations, when you start the back and forth of discussing the merits of the case, you cannot say, hey, what are the arguments that we should put the person down? You must start with what are the arguments of acquittal, of exculpation. Whereas with monetary cases, you could start either way, it doesn't matter. Number 3, and this already we spoke about in the past, with monetary cases, you need a simple majority of 1, both for guilt and innocence, regardless of how you want to rule in favor of the plaintiff or the defendant. You need a minimum of 1 in the majority. Whereas with capital crime cases, for acquittal, you need a minimum of 1. So 12 say acquittal and 11 say guilt. That is sufficient. Whereas for conviction, you need a supermajority of at least 2, which in practice means 3. You need to have a minimum of 13 to 10 in order to have a conviction. In addition, when you have a decision rendered, when you want to undo that, you want to appeal it. So with monetary cases, you can appeal it in both directions. Both if it was a faulty conviction or a faulty acquittal, you can always appeal it. Whereas with capital crime cases, you can appeal for acquittal, but once a person is acquitted, you can never say, oh, there's new evidence. You can never retry them after they have been acquitted. Number 5, with capital punishment, almost everyone, we shall say, almost everyone can offer an argument for acquittal, but only the justices can offer an argument for guilt. Whereas with monetary cases, everyone is allowed to present their arguments both for guilt and innocence. Number 6, once someone renders an opinion, so the way this is done, we'll talk more about this, but the way this is done is that there's the initial discussion and the initial deliberation and the initial vote, and then if the vote is for acquittal, the guy's off the hook. But if the vote is for conviction, then we have to have a second go-round to rediscuss and rehash out the matters and see if there's any argument for acquittal that could be a convincing argument. So the law states, this is difference number 6, that if someone votes for guilt in the initial vote, then they can change their mind and vote for innocence. Whereas when someone initially votes for innocence, then they would not be allowed in the second round to vote for guilt because they've already rendered their opinion. Now, the Gemara says that the truth is, when it comes to the final vote, they have to vote with what they believe the evidence shows. So even if initially they thought to acquit, and then once they really discuss the matter further, it turns out the person in their mind is actually guilty, then they must, in the final vote, they must indeed vote to convict. But in the deliberations, they must always present the argument of acquittal. Monetary cases, you start by day and you finish at night. Capital cases, you start by day, you must finish by day, and it must be the following day, like we mentioned. You have to sleep on it, basically. You cannot vote the same day you start the deliberations. That's the initial vote, and you must have a minimum of a second day of deliberations. If the initial vote is for guilt, you cannot convict based upon that. You have to sleep on it, and you have to once again turn over the case and the facts and see if you can find any argument for acquittal. And number 9, who begins the argument? If you have a court comprised of 3 justices or of 23 justices, how do you begin the deliberation? Who talks first? So when it's a minor matter, monetary matter, civil matter, matter of ritual, you always start for the most senior member. Whereas with a capital case, we're concerned that if the senior member renders a ruling, everyone's going to feel like, well, the die is cast. There's going to be a certain anchoring towards that person's perspective. And therefore, you start from the most junior of the justices and you work your way up to the most senior, so that way everyone could say their piece and no one feels like the matter has been settled. It's a fait accompli. And therefore, you get the opinions of everyone, not just the opinion of one. And finally, number 10, everyone is kosher. Everyone is qualified to judge in matters of monetary questions, monetary court cases. But with regards to capital crime cases, it's only Kohanim, Levim, and Israelites who are of good pedigree. So that's some of the introduction to this law of the differences that we see between capital crime cases and monetary cases. Now, the Mishnah tells us that when we have witnesses that come in and they make a very serious allegation, they allege that the defendant is guilty of a capital crime. So we have to, of course, investigate the claim, investigate the merits, investigate the evidence, investigate the witnesses, find out if there is indeed grounds for conviction here. But the Mishnah tells us that we actually intimidate the witnesses. And there's a very long piece in the Mishnah that describes exactly how they would do it. And they would bring them into court, and they would intimidate them. And they would say, you are making a very serious allegation. Perhaps it's not something you actually saw. A witness is only valid to testify on what they saw, not conjecture, not hearsay, not I heard from someone very reliable. You have to say only, or you're allowed to say only, what you saw with your own 2 eyes. And perhaps the court says to the witnesses, perhaps you may think that you're not going to be investigated. You can say whatever you want. Oh no, you are going to be investigated very thoroughly. We're going to go through your claim with a fine-tooth comb. We're going to examine every angle of this question, and we're going to investigate you to make sure that you are saying the truth. And you know what? Suppose you were making up a story. Suppose you are fraudulent. Suppose this is a hoax. Suppose you guys are spinning your web over here. Well, if this was monetary, it's no big deal. So you took money out of someone, you paid the money back, you ask for forgiveness, it's good. But if you convict someone who is innocent, not only is that person's blood in your hands, but their children that they would have had, and their grandchildren, and their grandchildren that they would have had, and their great-grandchildren, until the end of time, all those people you murdered. And it gives an example. Mishnah gives an example. When Cain killed Abel, the verse in Genesis 4 says that God said to Cain, the bloods, plural, the bloods of your brother are screaming to me from the ground. It's only the blood of your brother. Says Rashi, and this is again featured in our Mishnah. Cain murdered not only Abel, his brother, but Abel's would-be descendants, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren. For hundreds of generations, all that was captured into the one act of murder. And if you are a witness and you're making up a false story, and you are just alleging something that never happened, and you're going to get someone executed, you have to know there's severe gravity to what you are doing. And every person is so valuable. And when God created the world, he created many trees and many different types of vegetation and many different animals and many different birds and many different fish, but only one human. Because the purpose of the world is the human, and one human alone is worthy of having the world created for them. And that's the value of a single human. And if you save one human, we tell the witnesses, it's like you saved the whole world. And if you kill one human, it's like you've killed the whole world. You should be very, very, very careful about what you're about to do. Therefore, the Mishnah interjects, a person must always say, the world was created for me. One human, one atom. That is sufficient to fulfill the reason why God created the world. That's the end of the intimidation. And then we tell the witnesses, and now you're probably really spooked about this. You're intimidated. You're scared. And you may say, why should we do this? Why do we have to be involved in this? Well, if it actually did happen, you had better be involved. The verse tells that you are a witness. If you see something, you must say something. And it is prohibited for you to withhold your testimony from the court. And perhaps you may say, hey, what do we care if this criminal is roaming? Don't you know that when the wicked are destroyed from the world, there is delight and joy? So we're trying to balance this. We're trying to suss out if this is a true testimony, if this is legitimate. We want to hear it. We're desperate to hear it. But if it's false, stop now, leave now, abandon now, because you don't want to go there. And then we begin the cross-examination. In our mitzvah number 77, and again, we're following the order in which they appear in the Torah, is a collection of laws about how the court must process these witnesses. And it's always shaded towards favoring exculpation. When we have a judicial deliberation in a capital crime case, there are various different laws that fall under the category of this mitzvah that relate to how indeed we process this case, how we deliberate with this case. So number one, the justices must say their own opinion. They cannot rely on other justices. They cannot say, well, that guy's pretty reliable and he says it makes sense to him. I'll just follow along the coattails of the other justices. No, you must vote based upon your intellect, your understanding of the case, your understanding of the relevant laws. You must vote for guilt or innocence, exculpation or conviction without relying on others. You must say your own opinion and you must speak your mind. So that's number one. You cannot rely on the other justices. You can't say, well, this person is so knowledgeable and they're so wise, and I'm just going to say, well, it makes sense to them, I'll follow it. No, you must not do that. If you're a justice on a particular case, on a capital crime case, you must vote based upon what you know. In addition, another aspect of this law is how the deliberations are done. You cannot change your mind in middle of the deliberations if the initial assessment is acquittal. So suppose the case is presented from the court, and the court hears the arguments, we listen to the witnesses, we hear what they have to say, we hear their take on the situation, we have the defendant there as well, the defendant is presenting his position, and we have the initial discussion. And it seems to me, as one of the justices, that there was enough grounds for acquittal. And when we have the initial vote, I present my vote for acquittal. And then it turns out there are more than 13 justices who say, and it turns out that there are more than 13 justices that say, indeed, the person is guilty. So now we have to wait till tomorrow. And the whole night, we have to discuss the matter amongst ourselves. The Mishnah tells us that we're not allowed to eat, the justices are not allowed to eat. They have to be totally focused on the gravity of the situation. If they're going to execute someone, they better be sure that the person is guilty. And the next day, we've been discussing the matter the entire night. They come to court and they stand again for roll call. Do we have enough votes for acquittal? And everyone that yesterday voted for acquittal must vote today for acquittal as well. And if there are still insufficient votes for acquittal, well, then we have to have the second round of deliberations. But when I voted yesterday for acquittal, today I must vote for acquittal as well. And now what happens after the second round of deliberations and the final vote is going to be cast, then a person must vote with their conscience. A person must vote based upon the merits of the case. But during that initial kind of the second round, beginning of the second round of deliberations, the person voted yesterday for acquittal cannot change their mind quite yet. In addition, we have the first to vote. The way the Sanhedrin is comprised, we're told in the Mishnah, it's comprised of a semicircle. And you have at the outer appendages of the semicircle, you have the most minor justices, and in the middle, you have the most senior, the head of the court. And the way you started from the edge. Like we said earlier, you must allow everyone to voice their opinion. And what happens when you start from where you would naturally think, let's have the person who's the most qualified, let's have them render their opinion first. Well, that's going to shade and influence how everyone sees the matter. And we cannot rely on the opinion of only one person. And what's going to be when we have the opinion of only one person? Because the most senior person voted, and everyone's like, wow, that's convincing. Let me just follow that opinion. Or they're intimidated, perhaps. I don't want to argue with this great sage. Oh, he's such a veteran sage. How can I argue with him? Such a small person. I'll just vote with them. It's safety in numbers, right? Well, then what, in effect, you're going to have is that the entire decision is going to be rendered based upon the vote of one person. That is a corruption of the concept of a court. Now, the Sefer HaChinuch, the book that we're using to guide us through the mitzvos, he has an interesting little aside. He says, hey, this is one verse, and there are many laws deduced from one verse. We generally are calling this mitzvah judicial proceedings or judicial deliberations, yet there's various different laws that are derived from one verse that are kind of subcategories of this mitzvah. How do you deduce so many laws from one verse? So he quotes a famous teaching of our sages that there are 70 facets, but that there are 70 facets in the Torah. The Torah is multidimensional, and with one verse, you're going to have a whole host of different ideas. And then he adds, the verses were written very cryptically, and they were written very succinctly, and they were written in a way that they are designed to be unpacked using the tradition and the methodology of the oral Torah. We have Moshe, and Moshe is giving us both the written Torah and the oral Torah, and he's saying, hey, in this one verse, there are many different laws that fall under this category. And the Torah is not written so verbosely, and he adds another reason why, because it has many hidden secrets in it. And all those secrets are compacted and hidden beneath the veneer of the simple text. And then he adds, our sages tell us that the Torah contains so many secrets. In fact, it is the blueprint for the world. This is an idea that we talk about a lot, that the Torah contains the actual DNA, if you will, the instructions of creation of the world. And therefore, it should be no surprise that with one verse, you could find many different laws that emanate from it. Now, there's another idea here that the Sefer Chinuch tells us. When you look at how the Jewish perspective on capital crime is played out, if you read the Torah simply, there are many, many mitzvos that carry with it capital crime. I believe in the United States, it's only murder, I think, and treason that carry with it the weight of capital crime. In Torah, there are many, many, many laws that carry with it the weight, the gravity, the severity, the stringency of capital crime. And you would think, if you were to just read the Torah and know nothing else, just read scripture, you would think that, well, there's a lot of execution in Jewish law, in Jewish courts. Look how many mitzvahs contain with it the punishment of capital crime. But when you study the laws in more detail, and in this mitzvah as well, like the Sefer Chinuch tells us, there's always a bias towards mercy and acquittal and exculpation. And a lot of these laws, that we start off with arguments for acquittal. If you voted for acquittal yesterday, you have to vote acquittal today, etc. And we favor one, a minimum of one for acquittal. You need a supermajority for conviction. All that is to teach us a lesson that the Almighty indeed loves us, and He is not desirous of capital crime. And He gives a beautiful parable. To suppose you have a man that has 100 children. He has 100 children. These are 100 of his biological children. I would imagine he would need more than one co-conspirator for this. This is a parable. And he builds a city for his 100 children. And he settles them in that city. And then he realizes there has to be some system of laws. There has to be some sort of enforcement of laws, or else you don't have a functioning society. So he makes a rule that, well, if you hit your friend, if you hit someone, you're going to be fined. You're going to be punished monetarily. And if you kill someone, well, you're going to be executed. And that creates a certain deterrent to make sure that we have a good society, a functioning society, a healthy society, a righteous society. And what happens? One of his sons gets up and violates this law and kills another member of this city. And remember, these are all his children. He loves them all. Well, if he just lets them off the hook, well, then there's anarchy. And no one's scared of anyone else. You know there's no consequences. You could shoot your neighbor if he bothers you, if the music's too loud. So what should he do? What he would do is he would say, well, no, we're going to try this other son of mine, but we're going to look for every argument for acquittal. We're going to turn over every stone to make sure that if there is an argument, if there are grounds for acquittal, we are going to acquit them. And if you are able to acquit them, great. If not, the proper thing to do indeed is to execute them in order to maintain and perpetuate the society and the civilization, but that's not the desired outcome. And obviously the analogy is clear. The Almighty loves us. We are His children. He doesn't want us to be executed, but there has to be a system of laws. There has to be a deterrent. But in the event that someone is accused of this, we turn over every stone to find grounds for acquittal. That is the Torah's attitude regarding capital punishment. Now, the Sefer Chinuch, as he always does, he gives us some miscellaneous laws of this particular mitzvah. So, for example, we've seen this in the past. If everyone votes for guilt, the person is actually innocent, or at least the case gets pushed to a different court. And in the event that the vote is equal or it's not sufficient to go either way, we have to add the witnesses. What happens if someone says, I don't know, etc.? These are some of the laws that we talk about, very interesting laws. What happens if you have a court of 23 justices, and then there are other observers, apprentices, if you will, clerks, perhaps we could call them today, who are witnessing the case. And one of the clerks says, hey, I have an argument for acquittal. So if it's an argument for guilt, then we just ignore them. But if it's an argument for acquittal, we bring them up and elevate them to the court. And if they present their argument, and indeed it is good, they are promoted to become a member of the court. Their apprenticeship is over. They are now a full-fledged member of the court. They've proven their credentials. But if their argument is not good, we don't send them down. We let them stay there with us for the rest of the day, because what happens if the person knows, hey, if my argument is groundless, they're going to send me down, I'll be embarrassed. So people won't present their arguments, and therefore the way we prevent that is when one of these apprentices, when they make a claim and say, I have an argument for acquittal, and they come up to the court and they stay the rest of the day, at a minimum, as a way to not dissuade people from presenting their arguments. Now, the defendant themselves as well can also present arguments for acquittal, and we would listen to them provided that there is substance in their words. So again, we see that even though there are so many mitzvahs in the Torah that contain capital punishment ostensibly, it's not so easy to get a conviction. And whenever we talk about capital crime in Torah, it's important to mention the Mishnah in the book of Makros that tells us that if a Jewish court executes, according to one opinion, once every 7 years, according to the second opinion, once every 70 years, that is a bloodthirsty court, and that is not a court that's living up to the standards that is expected from such a court. So even though there are many laws that carry with the gravity of capital punishment, in actuality, the way the system is designed, and the way we always favor exculpation, and the way we turn over every possible clue to find exculpation, that indeed shows that it's not so easy. In fact, Rabbi Akiva, on that particular Mishnah, he said, if I was part of the court, there would never be an execution. Not every 7 years, not every 70 years, never. I'd be clever enough to always find an argument for exculpation. And then his colleagues told him, well, then okay, then there's no deterrent. If there's no execution ever, then there's no deterrent. And therefore, we have the other problem. There's going to be anarchy. But these are some of the laws, Mitzvah number 77, judicial proceedings and judicial deliberations. If you have any questions, you can always send me an email, rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. And the word rabbi is spelled like rabbit, but there's no T. So rabbi, and then one word, Wolbe, WOLBE, @gmail.com. Any questions, comments, or feedback is always appreciated. So I'm going to pause now so everyone can ask their questions before we start the next topic, which is the next Mishnah. Who wants to go first?
It sounds like the punishment is capital punishment. So in an American court, let's say it could be first-degree murder, or you could say, oh, same crime is manslaughter and the person goes to jail for however many years. So do we have gradations of punishment?
Yes. Yes, there are gradations of punishment. There are even within capital punishment, there are different levels of punishment. There's not all capital punishment is the same. There's 4 different levels of capital punishment for 4 different categories of sin. Yes, 4 different. The most severe sins have the most severe punishment, and the most relatively minor sins have the most minor or lenient of methods of execution.
So you're saying you're calling it a sin, or an American court?
Well, again,
it would be a crime against the state.
Well, it'll be a crime. We call it a crime against. Sin could be a crime against God. Think of it as just to make it uniform, right? It will be a crime against God. And that's how we would portray it, I think.
Yeah.
Yes. Who else?
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yes, go ahead.
Are there any ramifications for the judges if they make the 2 major errors? One being they fail to convict a guilty person, or they do execute an innocent person. So specifically the judges.
Okay, so that's a great question. And you would have to clarify what kind of mistake. There's different kinds of mistakes. There's mistakes that are not really mistakes, meaning that if they do everything properly and the person just happens to have gotten away with a fraud, that is one kind of mistake. It's not their fault. The Talmud actually there's a very dramatic story we've told in the past about Shimon ben Shetach. There was this rabbi that a bunch of people were upset at, and they hatched a plot and they executed his son. And before they killed him, they said, oh no, it was fake. We made it up. But they have to follow protocol. And the protocol says, in the event that every box is unchecked, every box is checked, you have to execute the person. So there's times where we follow all the protocol, and we do everything correctly. And the fact that someone lied and made up a story that's not in our hands, right? And the fact that the Almighty allowed it to go through, we would say that the Almighty wants the person to be killed. Well, I think we would say that's a controversial take, but I think I would say the most consensus would be that if someone's able to slip through the cracks and a conviction is able to go through, then even though the person is actually not guilty, that would indicate that the Almighty wanted that to happen. Now, there are those who would disagree with that, so I'm putting a little pin in that, right? But that would be one example of a mistake. It's a mistake, but it's not a mistake that they could have, they did everything that they were supposed to do. They followed protocol. There are other instances where there's a mistake that is an egregious mistake, where you have a law that's forgotten. Now, the Talmud does not assume that would happen in a capital crime case. You have 23 justices. Each one of them is someone who has smicha, meaning each one of them has been ordained to be someone who knows all of Torah. So to have a situation where there's 23 justices and not a single one of them would know of a certain law, and none of the people who are around would know of that law, that will be totally forgotten from everyone, that's very hard to imagine. The Talmud does spend a lot of time talking about what happens in a capital crime case. I'm sorry, in a monetary case. There's only 3 justices. It's a more minor case. There's less deliberation. And in that case, it's much easier to imagine that a law will be forgotten or omitted, right? It's the qualifications to be a judge in that court are lower, and there's only fewer people, and there's fewer observers, and there's less procedures, so to speak, in place to prevent that. So that's something that's much more imaginable. But to say that 23 justices and they'll forget a law completely, and it'll be that kind of an egregious error, very hard to imagine that would happen. But again, if the witnesses conspire and make up a story, that indeed, the Gemara gives an example of when that happened. That's possible. Because again, it's people are making up a story, and we're told we have to believe the witnesses. And if they check all the boxes, and it seems legit, what are we supposed to do? We have to follow the rules. And it's not our fault that we follow the rules. Our fault being the court's fault. It's a great question.
And in the case where you said that some opinions were that if the person was convicted and they weren't really guilty, and they said, well, maybe Hashem wanted that to happen anyway.
Yes, I put a pin to that, right? That's a controversial opinion.
Right, it's controversial. But it seems like I've read sometime that that it could be that person had escaped detection and something deserving capital punishment before, and that's why that happened to them that time.
That will be the explanation for that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Anyone else before we start the next Mishnah? Any other questions? Are we good? Okay. So if you have one of these, we're up to page 73 on the bottom. Yes, everyone ready? Let us begin. We are up to chapter 5, Mishnah number 8, and this is the first Mishnah of our chapter that is not going to give us a list of 10 things. It's going to be a list of 7 things, and then we're going to move on to lists of 4 things, and then we're going to move on to lists of 3 things, and so on. Mishnah in this particular chapter is going to deal with a lot of lists, and now we're up to a list of 7 things. Shiva Devarim Begolam. There are 7 things that characterize a golem, which here is translated as an uncultivated person. B'shiva b'chacham, and 7 that characterize a wise person. Okay, let's see what the 7 are. Chacham, number 1. Eino medaber lefnei misha gadol mimeno b'chacham v'minyan. A wise person does not begin speaking before someone who is greater than he in wisdom or in number of followers. Number 1. Number 2, and does not interrupt in the middle of the words of his fellow. Number 3, and he does not rush impetuously to respond. He asks questions with relevance to the subject, and he replies accurately. Ve'omer al rishon rishon ve'al acharon acharon, and he speaks about the first things first and about the last things last. Ve'al ma shelo shama omer lo shamati, and regarding things that he has not heard, he says, I have not heard. Umode al ha'emes, and number 7, he acknowledges the truth. These are the 7 characteristics of a wise person. V'chilufehem be'golam, and the reverse of these things characterize an uncultivated person. Okay, so this is a list of 7 things that characterize a wise person versus a golam, which we're translating here as an uncultivated person. Now, the term golam is a very interesting choice of word. Of course, if you're familiar with the Lord of the Rings, there's this Gollum, there's Golem, or if you're familiar with the story of the Golem of Prague, the legend that the Maharal of Prague created this Golem or Gollum kind of figure, like a human who's not fully developed, can't speak, doesn't have intellect, or doesn't have higher degrees of intellect. That is the word being used here in our Mishnah. What exactly is a Golem, an uncultivated person? So I saw an amazing Rambam here, and as an aside, perhaps the greatest expert, one of the greatest experts of all time in the precise meaning of words and understanding the subtleties of different words and things that are synonymous or almost synonymous, and the slight, minute, subtle differences. That's the Rambam. And he begins his comment to this Mishnah by telling us that there are various different words to describe someone who is maybe underdeveloped, uncultivated, not so wise, not so intelligent. And he gives us a list of 3 things that are going to be featured in the Mishnahs upcoming. One of them is a bar. A bar literally means a pit, but it also means a boor, like a boorish person. Am ha'aretz. Am ha'aretz means part, like a regular person, common folk. And a golem. And then there's the flip side, the wise person, the chacham, the wise person, and the chassid, which is the extra wise person or extra pious person. What exactly are the differences between these things? So he tells us that a boor or a bar is a person that has no qualities, not the intellectual qualities, not qualities of character and personality. And this person is almost like an empty slate. He's got nothing going for them. And just like a pit, if you want to cultivate your tomatoes or your potatoes or your wheat, and you have a pit, the pit is absolutely useless, nothing could grow there. Similarly, the boorish person is someone that really has nothing going for them or has no qualities worthy of admiration. Nothing could grow on that particular person. That's the boor. And then there's the Am Ha'aretz. The Am Ha'aretz is like the common person and common folk. And this person, they have certain qualities of personality and of character, but they're not so intelligent. They're not so wise. You can't rely on them in matters of intellect and kind of conceptual ideas. And this is a person that is a useful and productive member of society. They could hold down a job. They could be a good spouse, maybe even a good parent, a functioning member of society, but they don't have Torah. They don't have wisdom. And this kind of person is called a Am Ha'aretz. And there are some qualities that they have, but other qualities that they lack. And then you have the golem. The golem is someone that has qualities both of character and personality and of intellect. But the term golem, explains the Rambam, is someone who is not developed. It's like almost like a clod, like a thing that's not fully completed. It's uncultivated. It's unfinished. It's an unfinished product. It's half-baked. And such a person, they need to kind of learn the skills to hone and sharpen and develop and cultivate themselves to become a chacham. And because they have some qualities and they have some deficiencies as well, there's almost like a mixture, the Rambam tells us. It's like a hodgepodge. There are certain things that are good and there are certain legitimate qualities, but because they're not honed and refined and developed, it is akin to something which is unfinished, just like if you have a vessel that's under construction, it's not yet done, it's not yet useful. In the language of the Mishnah, the language in Hebrew, it's called a golem because it still needs to go to the craftsman, to the artisan, to be finished, and to give it its final look, its final shape, and it's not done. It's not perfected. And here the golem is someone that has the qualities, but they're mixed up, they're not organized, and they're not yet complete. And then when you have the level of a chacham, a wise person, that's someone who has all the qualities, and they are developed. And the highest level is a chassid, a pious person, who is a chacham, a wise person, plus they have additional qualities that are above and beyond the call of duty. Okay, so that's just the introduction. What exactly do we mean when we talk about a golem in our Mishnah? A golem is someone that has the ability, that has the qualities, but they're disorganized and they're not clear, and there's a mix, and they need to refine and develop further the qualities in order to become a finished product. And thus, the 7 qualities of our Mishnah that differentiate a chacham, a wise person, from a golem, from this uncultivated person, are essentially the 7 keys to develop that wisdom, to transition from someone who is a disorganized golem into someone who is a chacham, into someone who is a wise person. If we want to develop and cultivate the potential that we have within us, this is the place to start. So let's go through these 7 themes and see what we can learn. So the first thing it tells us is that a chacham, a wise person, does not speak before someone who is greater than he in wisdom or in number. So the first quality that is being described here is that of silence. To be quiet and to listen and thus to learn. When you are born, you're born with a lot of potential, but that needs to be developed. And one of the best ways that it gets developed is by learning. And by learning from others who are more wise, who are more experienced, who have more knowledge than us. But the only way to do that is A, to be silent, B, to listen, and thus to learn. So the first thing the golem needs to do, if they want to become a chacham, if they want to become a wise person, is to learn this quality. Your brain is not learning when you are speaking. A wise person is someone who considers that perhaps their priors, meaning the perspective and the attitude and the views that they walked into a discussion with, may be wrong or flawed, and therefore you're always open to have your priors being challenged. The golem is not like that. The golem wants to speak and wants to have their opinion and wants to share their opinion, wants to blabber. And the way to become a chacham, the way to become a wise person, is to listen to people that you disagree with and to be able to change your mind. The golem wants to talk. The golem wants to pontificate, to blabber, to bloviate, not to listen and learn. And I think there's a certain irony here. You know, the word golem, the way it's defined by the Rambam, is something which is unfinished. But in their head, everything is already settled science. Everything's already finished. Everything that they currently believe is to be unchallenged. And that's why they always want to talk. They always want to share their opinion because they think that their opinion is finished. If I believe it, it must be true. And that's the problem. A chacham is always upgrading. A golem is plateauing, is stagnating. And of course, when you stagnate, you begin to regress. So the first thing you have to know if you want to become a wise person is to stop and to be quiet and to listen and consider what others are saying. It's sometimes when we're in a debate or discussion, we're just waiting for an opening to say our opinion. And where our opinion comes from, who knows? Most likely it was just assigned to us by the television show that we watched, by the article that we read, by the particular kind of indoctrination that we received, or maybe we can even call it education. But education and indoctrination and brainwashing, as we know, are really different words for the same thing. Sometimes the brain actually needs to be washed. It's a little dirty, right? Brainwashing is a good thing sometimes. But if you walk into a discussion and you are sure, you are positive, the person sitting opposite you is ridiculous, is spewing nonsense, because what you know is what is true. After all, you know it. It must be that it's true. That attitude is the attitude of the golem. They just want to speak. And here we're told that if you want to become a chacham, you're always upgrading, you're always refining. Your positions on certain matters are willing to be challenged. And to do that, you have to actually listen and actually consider that it's possible the person who's sitting opposite you may have a point that you could benefit from. So that's number one. Number two, which is a very similar idea, that you do not interrupt in the middle of the words of others. When someone is saying an opinion, someone is saying a statement, someone is even asking a question, let someone finish their point and don't interject. And yesterday, actually, I was privy to a COVID argument. It was a wild COVID argument. Masks or no masks, Fauci, the CDC, vaccines. Should teachers be mandated to have vaccines? What about if someone already had the virus, they have acquired immunity? Does it make sense to give them vaccines? Should we trust the experts? Should we trust the CDC? Should we trust Fauci? It was a very lively discussion. And I was just an outsider observing it. And it was like this cacophony of screaming. And no one was letting anyone else finish their point. And one person was saying, well, tell me, who's your doctor? Who's your doctor? And I was like, well, what does it matter who's your doctor? Fauci lied. And I'm like listening to this conversation. They're both talking on different wavelengths. And no one's allowed to say their opinion because before they finish their statement, someone else interjects and starts screaming back at them. And I found this to be a very unproductive conversation, not just because it's an unproductive conversation in general. And it's not very helpful, right? But also, even if you wanted to have a productive discussion on this matter or any other matter, the way to do it is to clarify what is the other person saying. If you cannot restate your opponent or opponent's a bad word because we're not opponents, we're trying to find the truth, right? So the person you're talking to, you're conversant. If you cannot state their opinion more clearly than they could state it, you are probably not a good candidate to have this debate. A debate is only productive if I can restate your opinion in a way that's even better than the way you stated it, and I really distill the discussion down to what we're actually arguing about. What is the core of the discussion? Not just what's the posturing or what's the emotional angle of it, or what makes me feel good or bad or safe or secure. If you could actually state the opinion of the person you're talking to, and they say, yes, that's what I mean, and you could clarify exactly at what juncture of that do you disagree, and you could separate out, okay, this we agree upon, this we agree upon, this we agree upon, this we agree upon, and this is the core of the discussion, and this is what you say, this is what I say. That is the groundwork for a productive discussion. But the goal doesn't do that. Doesn't let the other person state their opinion, doesn't let the other person clarify what they mean, doesn't let the other person articulate what exactly is the point of contention. But that's not a productive discussion. That just descends into mayhem and arguing and even worse, name calling and the like. If we want to be a chacham, if we want to be a wise person, it is very advisable that we learn this skill. Let the other person say their piece, and only then let's evaluate it, see what the merits are, see what exactly we agree, find what you agree before you find what you disagree upon. That's a very productive heuristic for figuring out exactly what it is that we're arguing about and what it is that we are disagreeing about. Okay, number three, Ve'eno niva lahashiv. You don't answer a question impetuously. And the commentaries explain, if someone asks you a question, you don't respond until you hear every angle of the question and every argument of the question. And let the person speak their piece before you give them an answer. Make sure you know all the facts before you consider an answer. And once you give the answer, don't give the answer until it's very clear. And that way your answer indeed will be on point and accurate. I know my grandfather, blessed memory, he was someone who excelled in this particular quality. Whenever people asked him a question, and he would get many, many, many questions every day, he would almost never give a knee-jerk answer. Almost always, he would sit and ponder like for a minute. And you think a minute's not so much time, but try waiting 60 seconds before you give someone an answer. Just try that. It's almost impossible to do, to actually think about it. And I think the way to frame this is that there's a famous book called Thinking Fast and Slow, written by a gentleman by the name of Daniel Kahneman. And he talks about system 1 versus system 2 thinking. There's two ways that we think. There is like the things that we already know and are firmly established. And those are things that we could kind of pull at ease. We could call that maybe the RAM, so to speak, the working memory that we have. And then there's the things that we think on system 2 level, where you think and ponder and your mind is very active to try to understand the subject matter and to try to think through it. This Mishnah is telling us that when you are presented a question, you must apply system 2 thinking to find the answer. Think it through, actually use your brain, mobilize the superpower that you have balancing on your shoulders, think through the subject, and only then give an answer. It's something we're not accustomed to doing. Most of the time we just give knee-jerk reactions, whatever pops into your head. Can you imagine in an interview, you're interviewing someone, and they say, let me think about that? Or better yet, if there's like a debate, like a political debate, and the moderator asks the question, and the person says, let me think about that. I don't know exactly what the answer is. I got to think about that. And they spend a minute thinking about it. They would be ridiculed. Why? Because you have to give an answer right away. You have to give a little soundbite, a little zinger, right? You gotta resort to your talking points, right? It's a system that's designed for golems. That's the system we have. We want a wise president, but we set up a system that's designed to not get one. Ain't that unfortunate? Here we're told how to do it. Now I want to point to something very interesting. Our Mishnah tells us that when someone asks you a question, don't rush impetuously to give an answer. Spend some time pondering. Think about it. Don't give an answer right away. Problem is, there's a famous teaching in the Talmud, Book of Kedushin, page 30a, on the bottom. And the quote of the Talmud, and the Talmud quotes a verse in scripture that tells us that we should teach the Torah to our children. But it uses a very unusual word, vishinantam, which means you should sharpen the Torah to your children. Says the Talmud, why does it use that unusual word? Sheyiyu divrei Torah mechudadim beficha. The words of Torah should be sharp in your mouth. That if someone asks you a Torah question, you shouldn't mumble. You shouldn't fumble. You shouldn't say, I don't know, let me think about it. You should answer right away. It seems to directly contradict our Mishnah. Our Mishnah told us that when someone asks you a question, you should think about it, you should ponder it, you should question it, you should examine it. You should really ruminate and cogitate about the subject before you give an answer. And here the Talmud tells us, no, you have to give an answer right away. Which one is it? So I think the answer is like this. When it comes to matters of Torah, you have to become so familiar with the subject matter that it becomes second nature. It becomes part of your knowledge graph. It becomes part of your knowledge graph. It's the things that are so on top of your head, that are so readily available to you. It's like if I asked you your name, or I asked you to name your siblings, you know that right away. If you know Torah with such familiarity, you can answer any question right away, and you don't need to resort to system 2 thinking. I remember someone once told me, the person is going to remain unnamed because I disagree with him. Someone once told me regarding Rabbi Elyashiv. Who was Rabbi Elyashiv? Elyashiv was one of the greatest halachic authorities of the last 100 years. Passed away in 2012, I believe, at the age of like 105. But someone said, you cannot ask Rabbi Elyashiv halachic questions of matter of life and death. Why? Because it would be a question of life and death, a question of heart transplants, of end-of-life questions of very severe gravity. And the great rabbi would give you an answer in a second. When you think about it, it's a life and death question. How can you even answer in a second? Therefore, this person told me, you cannot ask him life and death questions. I think that person is wrong. Why? Because this great rabbi spent 100 years studying with such intensity and such commitment and such dedication, 18 hours a day, that matters of life and death, the Torah question, the Torah elements of those questions are so clear to him that he knows the answer right away. And it's the correct answer, because it's already been upgraded to system 1 level thinking. He's not saying a hunch. He's not saying something that he hasn't thought through. He's saying something that it's so clear to him, it's actually accurate. That's with respect to Torah study. If you're a golem, you're not someone who has all that Torah study. You need to learn to develop it. And before you can actually have something which you know for sure to be true, you have to have something, you have to have a process of thinking it through, developing it, really thinking about it properly before it indeed becomes acquired. Okay, the next thing in our Mishnah is that you ask questions relevant to the subject and you respond accurately. So the way the commentaries explain this is that whenever we're dealing with a certain subject and you want to ask the teacher a question, make sure it is on topic. Stick to the topic at hand. And the commentaries quote a Talmud. The Talmud says, when your teacher is involved in one matter and currently immersed in a certain matter, don't pull out a different book of Talmud that he hasn't seen in 10 years and say, oh, could you answer this question? It's not fair to the teacher to go off subject. If you want to answer that's on target, make sure the question is on target too. The next thing is that he speaks about the first things first and about the last things last. So simply put, this means that if there's 2 questions, you answer the first question first and the second question second. This is a quality we've seen. Rebecca, for example, Rashi tells us that Rebecca answered the first question first, the second question second. God as well in the conversation with Moshe. But the Rabbeinu Yonah says something fascinating here. What does it mean that you speak about the first things first and the last things last? What does that mean? So he says something fascinating. He says first and last in this context doesn't mean chronology. Doesn't mean which question, which subject was raised first and which was raised last. What it means is conceptually. In conceptual priority, which of these ideas are more important than the other? And this is what we would call first principles thinking. Any idea, any subject, there are the basic building blocks of those ideas, and we would call those the first principles. And you have those ideas first, and on top of that, you build those ideas. So if you want to answer a question, there's a system of trying to figure out what is the correct answer called first principles. Find out what is the kind of the basis of this idea, and what are the things that are built on top of that. And if you have the first principles correctly, and if you have the first principles organized correctly, then on top of that, the things that flow out of that can emerge quite seamlessly and naturally. So when it says you answer or discuss the first things first and the last things last, says Rabbi Yonah, this means first in the hierarchy of conceptual priority. What are the things that are the basis, the first principles of a given subject? And that is what you address first. And only later do you talk about the specific applications of that. Only then do you kind of draw the conclusions based upon those first principles. And that's a good heuristic, a good system for figuring out anything. What is the basis? What are the foundations? What are the building blocks of this subject? And what are the takeaways? What are the things that emanate, things that emerge from it? First principles first. Once you have that system, you build out of that. Whereas the golem is working with like ideas, isolated, discrete ideas, examples, analogies, and the like. And that system of using anecdote and analogy and trying to compare things in a vacuum without understanding where the things come from, without using first principles thinking, then that is a way to come to erroneous conclusions. Okay, the number 7 is, so number 6 is that what you don't know or what you haven't heard, you say you haven't heard. So again, Rabbi Yonah explains what this means. Suppose there's a subject at hand. There's a discussion, and you have some ideas, and you have some traditions as well. You have principles as well that you have received. When you respond to a given subject, it's okay for you to posit. It's okay for you to speculate. It's okay for you to opine on the matter. That is perfectly fine. However, you have to delineate, you have to differentiate. There has to be clear, defined boundaries separating what you know for a fact, based upon observation, based upon evidence, based upon tradition, based upon the sources clearly maintaining that. That has to be separate from what you are speculating. So, for example, this is obviously something that comes up a lot in Torah. Someone has a Torah question. If the Talmud talks about it, then you would say, okay, this is featured in the Talmud. If the Talmud doesn't talk about it, or if you're not aware of the Talmud talking about it, you must say, I don't know if this is indeed an established, a given point. I could still suggest, speculate, and maybe throw out ideas. That's okay, but I have to make that distinction clear. You have to know what you know and what you don't know, and maybe what you think. Those have to be separate. And in the eyes of the Chacham, in the eyes of the white person, they're separate. The Golem has a mishmash of the things that they know and the things that they don't know, but they think. And that is, again, one of the differentiations between these two. And finally, we have Modeh ala emes, when someone admits to the truth. When you have a debate with someone or a discussion with someone, and sometimes there comes a point in time in the discussion that you realize that you're conversant, that your opponent, the person you're talking to, is actually correct. And your perspective on the matter is incorrect. What you do at that moment determines if you're a golem or if you're a chacham, if you're an uncultivated, unfinished product, or you are a wise person. A wise person wants truth. A golem wants to win, wants to triumph, doesn't want to admit any failures, any shortcomings. So the Golam will persist. We'll continue arguing. We'll say, yeah, but does that really work? Or maybe we'll even descend, as narcissistic people do, to attacks on the person, to ad hominem attacks. We'll say, are you so much better than me? Who are you to talk to me? Don't you remember we did yesterday, the day before, the previous year? When you lose on the merits, the Golam either changes the subject or starts speaking on something unrelated or starts devolving into a word salad of just random words that don't string together. The Chacham, the wise person, knows, I want the truth. I want to know the truth. And if you want to know the truth, and the truth is presented to you on a silver platter, you say, thank you. You say, I appreciate that. You say, you know what? You are correct. And I thank you for illuminating it for me. And sometimes you could be clever and dexterous, and you could say, I'll disprove you, or I'll find a flaw in your argument, even though you know the argument is accurate. And that is the mark of the Golem. And there are many legends about great Chachamim, great wise people, when they were disproven. It's a mark of greatness when someone asks you a question that destabilizes or uproots your opinion, your position, your idea on a given matter, and you say, you know what? You are correct, I'm incorrect, and I'm hereby adopting your opinion. Someone does that, that is indeed the mark of a wise person. So here we have it. We have a list of instructions for us if we are undeveloped intellectually. We're a golem, in the words of our Mishnah. It means that we have perhaps the potential to become a chacham, to become wise people. But we need to follow these 7 keys to wisdom. We follow these 7 keys to wisdom, we indeed will become a wise person, because the golem has the chops and can be upgraded into a chacham, provided that they learn the keys, the secrets, if you will, to wisdom. And here we have it. 7 secrets to wisdom. I think if you're listening, my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. Rabbi spelled R-A-B-B-I, double B, B-B, like Bibi Netanyahu, former prime minister, R-A-B-B-I. And Wolbe is spelled W-O-L-B-E, O as an Oscar, and there's no letters between the B and the E. E as an echo. RabbiWolbe@gmail.com. Send me your questions. Send me your comments. Send me your feedback. It is great to speak to you. I am currently in Muncie, New York. I'm by my parents' home. I'm in the basement. It's quiet. There's no construction. Things are great. Thank God our drive to the Northeast was uneventful. We're here, and we hope you are well wherever you may be. And until next time, thank you so much for listening.